Good morning, everybody, and thank you for joining this webinar hosted by Freeths solicitors and James Cooper Cresta. Freeths and James Cooper have worked together for many years, helping businesses grow and evolve by steering them through the various challenges they face during the good times and through the bad. These being unprecedented times, we wanted to host a webinar to help you better understand the here and now of business. In particular, restructuring your company for returning to business as unusual, give further insight into the furlough scheme and how to make the most of it, and discuss the issues surrounding recovery and future planning. I'm Nick Butler, partner at James Cooper Cresta. I'm going to be discussing the coronavirus job retention scheme and its implications. And then I'll hand you over to Christopher Singh, Freeths specialist payroll management and employment law lawyer. Just a few details on housekeeping. If you lose us, please use the link you originally received to get back into the webinar. Please feel free to ask questions throughout the webinar by using the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll try to answer as many questions as we can. But if we can't get round to you, we'll follow you up after the webinar is finished. So, as I said, I'm going to talk to you about the coronavirus job retention scheme and what the revenue are calling phase 2, which most people are calling flexible furloughing. I'm going to cover off the summary of the changes. We'll look at which employees and which employers are included, how to work out flexible furlough pay and basic pay, and then we'll look at how we can claim it back. Before I move on, I thought it'd be useful to have a poll, which will just give me an idea of where people are at the moment. So if you could just do that for us. Good. I'm pleased at that. There's been a lot of negative press about flexible furloughing and many reports that some employers are not going to do it and they'd rather keep a fewer number of people on full furlough and not use flexible furlough. So that's quite encouraging for me. Thank you for that. So what's changing? So from July, and it's fair to say that the scheme is changing now each month, but from July, there's the introduction of flexible furlough. Now, it is an option, and this has to be made very clear. We've had a lot of clients that said, I'm not ready to bring people back. I don't have the work yet. Do I have to do this? The short answer is no. Full furlough, as has been the scheme up until the end of June, is what the revenue are referring to if you want to keep someone fully furloughed. So that's full furlough. Flexible furlough is an option for bringing people back. But some of the rules will change whichever way you're doing it. One of which, or the big fundamental, is that from the 1st of July, a period of furlough can be as little as 1 day. So the 3-week rule has gone. I'll come to it a little bit. It is a lasting legacy for a few weeks, but it has essentially gone. For July, the grant remains unchanged, 80% of base pay or normal pay, subject to the cap of 2,500. And the grant will also cover some associated employer NI and employer auto-enrolment pension costs. The claims periods now are not allowed to straddle the start and the end of a month. Essentially, and as we go through each month, you'll see why the scheme is now changing each month. But to be eligible for the scheme from the 1st of July, someone has to have been furloughed for at least 3 consecutive weeks in the period between the 1st of March and the 30th of June. Then we move into August. This is a subtle change. The scheme will still continue to pay 80% of wages up to the £2,500 cap, but it will no longer cover the associated employer's NIC or pension costs that it did or has done to date. And the maximum number of employees that you can include on claim in any single month can be no greater than any one single claim in the past. So the most that you've claimed in any of the previous months is 50 people. You can't now claim for more than 50 people in any one claim. In September sees the first of what I would call the bigger change, and that is that the grant will cover 70% of base pay, subject to a revised cap, so from 2,500 down to 218,750, with the employer remaining liable for the balancing 10% back to 80. You can still top up, but this is the minimum requirement. And then from October, the scheme grant will cover 60% of base earnings, subject to a revised cap of £1,875, again with the employer making up the remaining 20%. I think it's useful to have a look at quickly what has not changed. The last 3 months has seen everyone that's involved in furlough, whether from HR or payroll, get their heads around what it all means, and at the beginning it changed a lot. There are some things that remain. I'd just like to reiterate, flexible furloughing is an option. It is not the new way, it's not the only way forward. What hasn't changed, full and part-time salaries, they are still based upon the earnings prior to the 28th of February. The fact that the scheme is changing from the 1st of July doesn't mean that there's a new earnings period. It's still from there. The same can be said for people whose pay variances. It still works out on the average of the last tax year or the same period in the previous year, whichever is the highest. And as you move into flexible furloughing, you'll see that it's based on hours. The average will be based upon the average hours of those earnings periods also. Which employers are included? Well, effectively, it's, as I said, it's anyone that's been furloughed for at least 3 consecutive weeks prior to the 30th of June, even if they are now back at work. And that's why the Chancellor announced back at the end of May that if you wanted people to be included on furlough from the 1st of July, the latest date that they could be furloughed was the 10th of June. Now, I said earlier that the period of furlough must be for 3 weeks, and that rule's going, and from the 1st of July it can be from as little as a day. However, if the period, or the last period that started, was prior to the 1st of July, it's still subject to the 3-week rule, and it must run for 3 weeks, even if that ends up being the 10th or whatever of July. After that point, you can then introduce furlough or pay furlough from just 1 day. And the only caveat to anybody else on here who qualifies is if you are returning from parental leave, you would not have been able to have been furloughed prior to the 30th of June for 3 weeks. The Chancellor is very keen that these people are not left out, and therefore they are fully eligible to be included in the furlough scheme when they return. So it would be amiss of me to not do a brief legal mention here. Furlough is a contractual change. You should be agreeing what impact this has on the employees, with the employees, and then moving forward with their agreement. Usual employment equality and discrimination laws all apply during furlough pay, and you must keep the records for 5 years. And one important thing is the grants cannot be used to substitute or subsidise redundancy payments.
Nick, just on that point, I've been asked a lot recently about whether the guidance has changed around notice periods for someone that's been dismissed. Do the grants still cover any notice periods on termination?
Yes, I think it's a grey area. Originally, there was no doubt. There's been some comments coming out of the Treasury in recent weeks that's making it a bit grey. My own opinion is yes, it still does. There's nothing that explicitly says it cannot. It cannot cover redundancy, as I've said, but notice period, as far as and commentators are saying, we believe it does cover notice pay period.
Thank you.
Right. So, how does it work? How do you work out flexible furlough pay? And it's always good to go through an example. Essentially, flexible furlough works from pay and claim periods, and then uses hours to obtain the available grant or pay or furlough. So let's assume we're claiming for July. We need to work out the usual hours of work, the minus or take away from that the hours that someone's going to work, and then you arrive at the furlough hours to be paid. So let's look at this example. So Joanna Bloggs is contracted to work 40 hours a week on a salary of £3,000, and she's been asked to return to work on the 1st of July, working half days. You can tell I've made it nice and simple for this example. So the step one is to work out the usual hours. So she works 40 hours a week. We divided the number of calendar days, which is the revenue's preference. And her contract is 40 hours per week. So that's her repeating work pattern is a week. So you divide the weekly hours by 7, and you multiply it simply by the number of days in the month. So calendar days in July, 31, we get to 177.14. Now we can now round that down to 177. That's last week's change from the revenue. If prior to that, you had to always round up, but you are allowed to round up or down now.
Mick, I was just wondering, you've got you divide it by 7 days a week. Why are you not dividing by 5 days a week? Surely Joanna only works 5 days a week.
This is true, but the revenue have been consistent throughout furlough, that whenever they've looked at any form of proration or any formulas, they've always worked at calendar days. The rationale behind that is that there are different work patterns within a week. So some people will work Saturday, some are Sunday. So if you do it by 7, that's the constant.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so step 2. So we've worked out if we work out the standard hours, we now then to look at or take off from that the number of hours worked. So there's 23 working days in July, and we know that Joanna's going to work half days, which she's normally 8, so that's 4 hours a day. 4 times 23, she's going to work 92 hours. In July, we can take the 92 from the 177 and arrive at 85 furlough hours to be paid and to be claimed. It is that simple. We then have another step, step 3. If we take the standard monthly pay, which is 3,000 for February for Joanna, that was her contract. Furlough pay for the last few months on full pay is 80%. Or the cap of 2,500. So 80% of 3,000 is 2,400. She doesn't break the cap, so that's the furlough pay that she should have been being paid for a full month on furlough, and the one we'll use for this. And we simply take it and divide it by the number of usual hours worked, multiply it by the number of furlough hours to be paid, and arrive at the furlough pay to be paid in July of 1,152.54. Now in the payroll, you would need to add the base pay. Base pay has to be paid at full pay. So half time for her would be £1,500. You add that to the 1152.54. Her gross pay for the month is 2652.54, and that's subject to the usual deductions as any other gross payment. Now, the Chancellor didn't intend to introduce flexible furlough in August, and by the time, until August, and by then the NIC and the pension contribution was going to be removed or will be removed from the grant. But this does somewhat change the way that the national insurance and employee pension portion can be or is calculated on the grant. So it's very worth going through this for you. First, we need to apportion the secondary NIC threshold. Secondary NIC is employer's NIC essentially. It's a monthly payroll, so the threshold of 732 is divided by the number of days in the earning period. The earning period is monthly payroll, so it's the month. In this case, she's going to be furloughed for the whole month, and therefore the claim period is the same. If someone, for example, was only going to be furloughed for 2 weeks of the month, you could then have the 732 divided by 31 times by, say, 14. So you know what days the furlough period is, and this prorations the threshold accordingly. So in our case, the dividing by 31 times by 31 has no impact. You divide what's left by the 177 usual hours and multiply by the 35 hours that are claimed. So the apportioned part of the threshold is 351.52. So if we come to how much NIC we can claim on the grant, you've got 1152.54 furlough pay. We simply deduct the apportioned threshold and multiply the rest by the basic rate of employer's NIC, which is 13.8%. So 110.54 is the employer's portion that can be claimed for July. Of course, after July, you can no longer claim this, so this is only a calculation for 1 month. Exactly the same formula is used for the pension. but we work off the lower level of qualifying earnings, which is essentially the same as the lower earnings limit for national insurance. So starting at 320, I won't go through the formula again, it's the same formula, but we get to 249.71 off the threshold. The same calculation, you take the furlough pay, you deduct the apportioned threshold and multiply the 3% that's allowable. So essentially, Joanna, or we for Joanna, can claim the furlough pay, the employer's NIC and the employer pension contributions totaling 1290.16 for the month of July. Now the actual claim process is exactly the same. It's via the HMRC portal. So if you've got more than 100 people to claim, you have to upload a file. If you have fewer than that, you have to manually input them. But you will also need to know some additional information now. So you'll need to know the amounts that you've worked out, the standard hours or usual hours worked, the actual hours worked, and therefore the furlough hour claimed. Now that's quite a lot to take in. The revenue have given us a very useful slide, and that's what's up here now. This breaks it down by what the employer and what the government are going to contribute from July through to the end of the scheme in October. So if I leave that screen there now, this will be a good time to see if we've had any questions on the Q&As. So bear with. Okay, it doesn't look like we've done any questions, so that's quite good. I think we'll be going from a starting point that most people were quite confident anyway, but I've got another poll just to gauge how you feel now that we've gone through this. So let's have a look here. And we'll hope that the score hasn't gone down, or the level of confidence. Lovely. That's exactly what I wanted to see. So thank you for your time with me. What I'd like to do now is pass over to Christopher, who's going to take you through to the legal restructuring part.
Thanks, Nick. Yeah, good morning, everyone. I'm Christopher Singh. I'm a partner in the Freeths employment team. You probably noticed these are volatile times, and many businesses at the moment are looking to either restructure or repurpose themselves altogether, and that means realigning your employees to match your new and future business needs. And I'm going to look at a couple of ways of doing that. So I'm going to spend about 20 minutes looking at two key areas. One relates to varying a contract of employment, so changing terms and conditions for employees to realign them, and the second is the inevitable and perhaps sad area of redundancy, but part of that is getting the process right, so we'll be looking at that as well. There's a third key area that I would usually talk about when I talk about these areas, and that's the people issues, the practical issues. I'm not going to talk about much of that today because Sandra's speaking after me, and she's been at the pointy end of these processes. Sandra's been involved in actually staring employees in the face during these processes, so I'll let her touch on most of that. So, varying a contract of employment, as Nick said, this is in the minds of employers at the moment, because you'd need to do that to make use of the new flexible furlough scheme to make people work part-time or work more flexibly. That all requires agreement or some kind of variation to the contract with the employees. But there are many other reasons at the moment. You've noticed that people have been forced to work from home, and the contracts of employment in many cases are lagging behind that, even though some of those changes are going to be long-term or maybe even permanent with new ways of working. Equally, when you're returning to work, you may need to stagger start times, perhaps have extra shifts in the evening or weekends to make sure there are less people on site. All of those are potential variations of the contract. So I'm going to look at ways of doing it. So first of all, when you know what you need to do, have a look at the contract of employment. It may help you. You may have the right to change the contract in a particular way. If there's a clear and express right to make a change, then you can do so. And if there's not a clear and express right, then maybe there's a clause broad enough to enable you to make certain changes. So have a look at that. Just bear in mind, if you're going to vary a contract by using the existing terms, you'll want to consider whether you're acting reasonably to do so. So if you're changing a significant term Is that too much of a change without getting agreement, or are you allowing reasonable notice for someone to make those change arrangements? Secondly, this is probably usually the starting point for most employers, is talking to the member of staff. Can you do it by agreement? And if you do it by agreement, and actually at the moment, workforces are incredibly pliant. They're agreeing to lots of different things that perhaps wouldn't have done in the past because A, they know these are strange and difficult times and it will help the survival of the business. But two, they're quite keen to get back to work. They've been on furlough for a period of time. They want to make sure they can be useful. If you are varying a contract of employment, it's pretty similar to entering into a new contract, and there are some legal voodoo around it in terms of consideration. A variation of contract only really works if you have something of value passing between the parties. So think about what's happening in that situation to make sure it's a binding variation. If you want any advice on that, obviously give us a call. It's always good practice to have a variation of contract in writing. It's not necessary, but if there's a dispute later on, you'd want to have something in writing. So think about doing that. Thirdly, unilateral variation. This is the Braveheart approach. This is when you simply impose a variation on an employee who may be disputing it. If you do that, it might be successful. One of the options the employer has is acquiescence. They can go along with that imposed variation. But just bear in mind, if you are doing that, they could equally resign and claim constructive unfair dismissal. So you want to think very carefully about imposing changes without any consultation at all. Another thing they could do is simply refuse to work to the new terms. And then you'll be forced to take steps to do something about that refusal, and that may end up being dismissal in itself. And the fourth thing they could do is just stand and sue and work under protest and pursue for damages. So if you're going to force through a unilateral change, think very carefully about that. Lastly, there's dismissal and re-engagement. This is another confrontational approach, but it may be necessary if you've got important changes that the workforce won't agree to. If someone doesn't agree to a change, you can consider dismissing them, and the likely reason for dismissal will probably be what lawyers called some other substantial reason, which is the area that we lump everything else that hasn't got a specific reason, because the some other substantial reason here is going to be a change requirement for the business that's required to make, such as survival, or it could be to protect the health and safety of workers. So if there's an important change that isn't agreed, you can think about dismissing those people and re-engaging them on new terms, and the new terms would be the new terms that you need them to work to. You might expect me to say, because I'm a lawyer, you'll probably want to take legal advice about any of these options before implementation. And Nick mentioned before as well, that when varying a contract of employment, it is worth bearing in mind potential discrimination factors. Often variation and change in terms can have an impact indirectly on people with protected characteristics, so people with childcare who maybe would like to be women, or people with disabilities. So think about those issues as well. Redundancy. I'm going to take you through some aspects of redundancy. Redundancy is defined in the law, and this is probably the only bit of law, proper bit of law in my talk this morning. Redundancy, it's got three key definitions. It's when an employer stops doing the work that the employee is employed to do, or it stops doing that work at the location where the employee is employed to do that work, or the amount of work is reduced, so it needs fewer employees to do it. That's the definition of redundancy. I'm going to tell you in a moment that redundancy is really straightforward in terms of the process, and I'm going to take you through that process because often it's the fear of the unknown that employers get worried about, the people conducting these meetings. And if you know the unknown, it's less scary, but also if you know what you're going to do, you can tell the employees what you're going to do, and that greater transparency helps with disputes. Just before I take you through the process, I want to run a quick poll to see how many of you have been involved in processes previously. I'll give you a few seconds to respond to that. Wow, 83% of you, that's most of you. Well, that is, I was going to say great news, but perhaps it probably isn't such great news. But what I would say, it's always a good thing to be reminded of best practice, and I'll go through some do's and don'ts. Because there are so many people in this group here today that have been involved in processes, feel free to put in the chat or the Q&A some of the tips that I've missed out as I go through, and we'll perhaps have time at the end to talk about those. Right, this is my 5-point plan. Actually, before doing that, I just want to run you through it in overview, because I've worked out how to use the laser pointer on here. So I'm going to see if I can, there we go. Really, it's quite straightforward. First of all, you work out what you want to do and how you're going to do it. Then you tell the staff what you're going to do, and then you listen to what they say about it. And once you listen to what they say about it, you consider whether that changes your plans, and then you decide and feed back to the staff. It really is that straightforward. It is a linear timeline. So let's have a look at those things in more detail. So first of all, I mentioned that you propose. So, or I should say as an aside, this process is about individual consultation. If you were looking at dismissing 20 or more people at a single establishment, you need to collectively consult as well. The process for that is an additional layer, and this process would still apply. I'm not going to deal with collective consultation this morning because of time issues. So first of all, think about what you want to do and why you want to do it. My advice to our clients is always draft an organogram of your current structure, and then get a blank piece of paper and draft a new structure, which is the perfect structure you need in place for either current circumstances or the future. Because once you know where you are and where you need to get to, you can work out what process you need to follow to get there. That will also start throwing up which roles are at risk and where there may be potential legal exposure in areas. You can work out how to treat people fairly and how to get to the right solutions. At that stage, as part of that process, you'll start to see what roles are at risk, so you can think about the appropriate selection pools for redundancy. If you don't think about the pools, the dismissal is likely to be unfair. But there is a wide discretion about pools. There is no fixed rules. There's a range of reasonable responses, and there might be a variety of permissible pools. All you need to do is genuinely apply your mind to the pool and have good reasons for choosing that pool. But just bear in mind that employees won't always agree with the pool, but an employment judge won't and is not allowed to substitute their own view for the pool as long as you've been reasonable in your selection. And pools can be really quite narrow. It can be a pool of one. There's only one widget maker and you don't need widget makers. That's the person that's going to get selected. And you also, another example would be of a narrow pool. If you have a number of territories for salespeople and it's one particular territory that's been affected, it's not necessarily unreasonable to only put that person at risk in that territory, even if you've got other people doing the same job in other territories. And there's considerations around that, but it can be that narrow.
Christopher, can you explain the implication of bumping and selection pools?
Yes, yeah, bumping is a great word because we used to have those Latin words in law. Now we've got questions, almost like bumping. Bumping is when you put someone into the pool that wouldn't necessarily be at risk. So an example might be you've got a newspaper, you've got an editor and a deputy editor, and then perhaps loads of writers. And if you determine that you don't need the editor anymore because the supervision is going to be done by someone above them at director level, you usually have a pool of one because you've got a editor that's at risk. But what can happen is the editor can say, well, I'm at risk, but actually I've done the deputy editor's job and I've got interchangeable skills, so they should be in the pool. It's unreasonable not to have them in the pool. So then you bump someone who's not redundant into the pool for selection. And in terms of redundancy, you don't have to bump people in the pool in every process, but the employment tribunal would expect you to consider it. So in all processes, you should be considering bumping as your own volition, even before employees mention it. And if you're not going to bump, there should be probably some reasonings for that.
Thank you.
And as part of that, actually, it leads me on nicely, thank you, Sandra, to some of the considerations for your pool. The things you want to think about are what type of work is ceasing or diminishing? So where is the reduction? But also think about employees doing similar work, which may be the bumping scenario that Sandra's just asked me about. And are there other employees of interchangeable skills that are relevant to that process? What's really important to look at, because I've seen people get this wrong, is look at what the employee actually does, not what they were employed to do, not what they used to do, what they're doing at the moment, because you're making them redundant because there's a reduction in their work. So it needs to be the work that they're doing. Once you've got the pool, you may need to apply selection criteria if there's more than one person in it. That criteria should be objective wherever possible. More and more employers want to use objective criteria, and that can be acceptable as part of a blend, particularly if they have more than one manager marking it, because you can get rid of some of that subjectivity by having a number of managers marking it. But I say objective criteria is better. I'm not going to go through that today, but as my gift to you, if you'd like a template of objective selection criteria, I have one. So just drop me an email after today and I'll send that out to you. Right, back to the process. We're now looking at informing them because you've decided what you're going to do and how you're going to approach it. So it's now time to tell the staff about it. Ideally, you'd meet with all the staff at the same time that are affected and tell them in a group, because if you don't meet them all the same time, or as fewer groups as possible, then you get one group telling another group, and you want to control the information. So if you can, meet all the employees at the same time to warn them about what's happening, what the proposals are, but explain these are just potentials at the moment, because these are proposals that are subject to consultation. You also want to tell them about the things you're taking, the steps you're thinking about taking in relation to reducing redundancies, which may be using voluntary redundancy, early retirement, there may be alternative roles you're creating as part of the process, and there may be alternative jobs as well. It's a good time to say to the employees that you will be asking for suggestions from them to avoid redundancies, because that helps with the consultation. They'll be ready and prepared to deal with those points. And if you are thinking about using voluntary redundancies, let them know and ask them to volunteer, because if people volunteer, it may mean the later process you follow will be smaller and less meetings involved. If you are using selection pools, then let them know what those pools are and explain to them what the proposed selection criteria is, so they can also consult about that and think about that. Right, once you've done all that, it's sensible to put it into writing. So these employees you're talking to would not necessarily be expecting the things that you're about to say. So if you can confirm it in writing afterwards, it gives them a chance to reflect on what you said. It's good for evidence to say what you set out to those employees. And what I would usually suggest you do is write that first letter first, because if you write that first letter first about all the important information, that's your script for the meeting we just spoke about, and you'll keep that script, and it means the letter you send will reflect what you just said. After you've done that, you start doing the scoring, and you'd score each potential redundant person against your criteria, and you'll start then provisionally selecting people for redundancy. It's a really good idea to create a template for scoring people, and I've mentioned I've got one for you, and that template should have examples in it as well. So if you're saying I'm giving a score of 4 out of 5, in the example section you'd say why, and you'd give examples why that merits that score, because that enables you then to have a form of consistency for each employee that you're marking, and it maybe you've got more than one manager doing it and they're all doing it in a consistent way. So once you've done that, you can start writing to those employees that have been provisionally selected for redundancy, and you'd invite them to a meeting to discuss that provisional selection. And that letter would send out all the information that's required. So it tells them they've got the right to be accompanied. It explains to them why they've been selected. It repeats to them why the redundancies in the first place, so what you told them at the first meeting, and it will likely include their scores, so they can get a chance to consider their scores and make representations at the first meeting. You've probably noticed that what I'm saying is that we're doing all our talking in writing, and that means that we can control what we say. And largely speaking, when we're having meetings, that's the listening exercise, listening to what the employees have got to say. Right, so we've now told our employees what's been proposed. They've had a chance to consider that, and now it's their chance to respond to these proposals. So we're going to start listening to what they've got to say. So you're having these meetings with staff. Scores are often a hot topic during these meetings, and the employees will have their individual scores to be able to make representations about. And you should explain in that process how those scores were arrived at, and you have your little template to be able to do that, and give those employees a chance to challenge their scores. Listen with an open mind here. And as I said, this is mostly a listening role. If there are alternative roles that you're creating or that exist, even in group companies, talk about those as well, and do that with an open mind. You will be, maybe not, but I'm always astounded about how many very senior employees in employment tribunals say they would have taken a junior role on. So you've got these CEOs saying, well, I would have swept the floors if that had been an opportunity for me, because I didn't want to lose my job. And that might be right. But the point is, it was never put to them in the consultation process. So don't make assumptions for people. If you think there's a role that they could do, don't decide whether they would do that, offer it to them, talk to them about it. Because if they say no in that process and you make a note of that, it's very difficult for them to dispute it later on. Keep a detailed note of that meeting. It's always really important. Employment tribunals turn on paperwork, so keep as many notes as you can. I think a dedicated note taker is a really good idea if you've got capacity for that in your organisation, because if you imagine that the person there is at risk of redundancy, if you can look them in the eye and connect with them rather than stare at a piece of paper, that's really useful. So have someone take the notes if you can. So they've said what they've got to say. We're now going to have a think about that. And after the meeting, you'll follow up any suggestions they've made and make any inquiries you may need to make. And that's some really good ideas. And that's the case. Think about, does that change your proposals? It may also be that their scores change because what they told you, they may reveal qualifications they've got or talk to you about experience they've got, and that may change your scores. If that is the case, we need to go back to work out if that changes the pool for selection. And you may need to repeat parts of the process to talk to the other employees that are now at risk. So we've heard from them, we've investigated, thought about it, and we've decided now. So we're feeding back. Where you decided that an employee is going to be made redundant, you would invite them to a further meeting to let them know about it. And that letter would likely set out all the considerations they've given you in the last meeting and how you responded to those. And it's important to allow employees to be accompanied at those meetings by an appropriate representative. But assuming nothing has changed, at that meeting, you'd be confirming the selection for redundancy, and you'd go through the selection payments at that time. You probably would mention it earlier in letters, but it's important to go through it again to make sure employees know the next steps. And once again, take a detailed note of that meeting. That's nearly it. There may be a right of appeal if people choose to appeal, and you should give a right of appeal. I haven't put it in my 5 steps because it made it a 6-step process, which didn't quite fit on my screen. So I've added it on here. If people do appeal, it's important where you can to have a more senior member of staff do that appeal meeting to the person that was dealing with the original meetings, if possible, and again, give them a right to be accompanied. I'm going to spend 2 or 3 minutes just going through some do's and don'ts. And I've mentioned some of these during the process already, but I'll just touch on some again. So I mentioned at the start, remember these are proposals. Keep telling yourself these are proposals. It's incredible how many letters I see from employers saying we are going to do this. Well, what's the point of consultations? That's the case. So keep in mind the proposals, tell the staff that, and at each stage keep that in mind as well, and including that any selection for redundancy is provisional until you've considered the consultation process and made a final decision. Remember your role is to listen. So consultation is about them feeding back to you on your proposals. So don't be afraid to use the material you've got as prompts. If you draft good letters, you can say, look, you've seen the things we're going to talk about, include this. What do you say about that? What do you say about this? So go through those as prompts and make a full note. And don't be afraid to say you'll look into it. It is completely okay not to have immediate answers. So if you're in a meeting with an employee and they throw you a curveball, just say, fine, I've got a note of that. I'll look into that and come back to you. Don't allow yourself to put onto the spot. And this is me being a bit paranoid. Assume you're being recorded. There's nothing really wrong being recorded if you're not saying things that are oppressive or clearly wrong. But it's quite useful to remember that you might be recorded because it does change your approach to things. And you often, and by the way, covert recordings can be used in evidence in the employment tribunal. And when you hear recordings, often the employee is trying to lay a trap by asking a loaded question. So assume you're being recorded, and even well-meaning reassurances can come across badly in recording. So just be transparent, be honest, don't give reassurances you can't follow through. Avoid agreeing to things or refusing submissions, because you can just say, like, I've got that, I'll look into it, rather than being put on the spot. Do keep in mind that people, Sandra's going to touch on this, but just remember people are going to be upset. They may need breaks. They may need prompting, like, is there anything else you want to tell me? The things we are going to cover is this. Can you talk about that? Because they may be confused. 83% of you have done this process before. These people may not have done. And keep a cool head. They're going to be upset. And it's best that if you can try and make sure that you don't buy into that emotion and try and take a step back. I've mentioned paperwork. I can't stress enough that paperwork is king. Do it well. It will help justify what you've done. And I've mentioned using templates and sharing the same templates. I've been involved in quite a few discrimination claims where an employer has a selection criteria for someone with marks and not for another person because they've got lost in the midst of time. It's very difficult then in terms of, say, a race discrimination claim to show that someone's been treated equally, because you can't justify the mark. So keep the paperwork and do it well. Also, having those sort of templates where people are forced to mark it and give examples helps to explain to an employee, this is a business decision, it's not a personal issue, because we're following a process. Do take advice. It may not be you doing the process, it may be your staff doing the process, and make sure you're available for that advice, because if you do get thrown a curveball, you can postpone a meeting if you feel the need to respond then, and just ring up someone and get some advice on that. And don't go off the process. This is quite robotic because you are going to be approached by employees, and perhaps not so much now, but in corridors, by email, from phone calls, by WhatsApp messages. And again, those well-meaning reassurances can be problematical. Be available and talk to people about the process, but avoid holding the formal process and consultation offline, because that can be an issue for you as well. I've seen so many unhelpful documents be put in front of a manager in the future when they've been caught off guard in that way. I said don't make assumptions. I mentioned that before. So in a meeting, listen and don't assume people don't want to do certain jobs or certain things. But one last point, which I think is really important in our changed times, is don't make assumptions about the forum either. Lots of people doing video calls at the moment. We're on a Zoom call now. It may well be that when maybe you can't meet in person about redundancy, and that is probably the best way of doing it if you can do it. If you can't meet in person, don't assume that Zoom or Teams is the best way either, because some employees don't want you looking into their living room while you're dismissing them. They don't want you to see them crying. So if you are going to use that kind of forum, you think it's the best way, give employees an option. Say, look, we're recommending video call. Is that okay with you? Do you want to do it in telephone or a different way? It may be they do it by Zoom, but turn the video off. So just be open to that so they're more comfortable. I will look at questions briefly. I'll turn this screen off. I think there may be a few. Some of them are for you, Nick, so we might come to them at the end.
That's fine.
Yeah, so what I've been answered is, can COVID, because of COVID, can it be done over the phone? Yes, you can do it over the phone. Consultation should be genuine and meaningful, so do what you can to do it in the best way possible, as I was saying. If employees are working from home, is it best to get them to sign a new agreement? I've been asked. Yeah, probably. It may be, as I said before, that maybe the contract allows you to vary their place of work. So that's the case, just confirm it in writing to follow up. If they're going to be working from home temporarily, it's worth putting that in writing and confirming it's temporary, if that is the case, or until further review, because you don't want to sleepwalk in a situation where there's been a permanent contractual variation and you want them back, and there may be reasons why you want them back. So if it's permanent or temporary, confirm that in writing as well. And some people, because of the urgency of getting people from home, haven't done appropriate risk assessments. So that's worth doing as well if you're confirming in writing. And bear in mind that working from home has been shown to increase productivity, but not when it's been forced, when it's by choice. So again, don't assume they're always going to be working from home if they can return to work in the office in the near future. So talk about that by agreement and getting that right. Will COVID affect GP protections? No, I think the answer is it may well be that it'd be easier to dismiss people post-transfer. I guess I haven't really thought about it, because you may have any economic, technical, organisational reason to dismiss people because the organisation is different, and pandemic is an economic crisis. So it may have those issues, but consultation needs to be, again, genuinely meaningful, even that's done by video conferencing, and have the same rights against unfair dismissal, unfair dismissal, and the same protections about changing the terms of employment. And one's for Nick, so I will skip across that until the end. So Sandra, I will pass over to you.
Thank you very much, Christopher. Let me try and share this screen. So afternoon, everybody. I'm Sandra Mundy. I'm a business restructuring and insolvency partner with James Cooper. I'd like to start off this part of the presentation with a poll. These are very challenging times for businesses, and I was just wondering if you could let me know what is your biggest concern that you think will affect the business over the next few months. Just give you a few moments to answer that. Okay. Yes, it doesn't surprise me, a second spike. I think that is a big concern, because I think that will have potentially a large impact on the economy and what businesses might have to respond to and how they may have to respond to that. And certainly your next point being access with concerns about customer demand. Yes, emerging from lockdown, it's an unknown quantum, and therefore that makes forecasting very difficult. I'll just move on to the next slide. Okay, so we've certainly all seen that different businesses have been affected in different ways by COVID-19 and the lockdown. Certainly there have been some businesses that have had a positive experience. So if you look at the supermarkets, they've been reporting bumper profitability over the last few months. Certainly people like the Zoom call that we're on today, again, that's been brilliant. I don't know about you, but I have an Amazon delivery pretty much every day, so the delivery network's done very well as well. But there have been much harder hit areas, and I think these businesses will be looking at their cost base over the coming months. And of course, one of the largest areas of the cost base may well be the employment, the payroll side of things. So in particular, the oil industry have been hit very hard. We've seen that, you know, there has been practically they would pay you to take away oil at one point. Unfortunately, nobody did pay me to take away oil. Travel, leisure, tourism, much more sort of in my marketplace, that has been affected. There was obviously measures announced yesterday by the Chancellor to try to bolster that part of the economy, but I still think that that will be problematic going forward. Retail was experiencing a structural change in the first place because of the move towards online acquisitions, and I think that the lockdown has just accelerated that process. I think landlords will really struggle potentially going forward as people reappraise what kind of space that they need going forward when their leases come up for renewal. Certainly offices may well decide that actually, as Christopher was just saying, that it might well be desirable. Employees may desire to work at home, businesses may desire them to work at home more often. So the actual space that you may require going forward may be significantly reduced. And certainly if we see large levels of redundancies coming through in the coming months, then any businesses where they are providing goods or services that are in the discretionary spend area, I would expect them to be quite hard hit coming up. So one of your major concerns that you identified on my poll there was what will happen to demand. We won't really know what will happen to demand until lockdowns measures start to relax, which they have done so far, only to some extent, but I think we'll see that unfurl over the coming months. There is also customers, have they changed their behaviour? So we were talking about retail just a moment ago. There's been a change in behaviour. Will they change it back again to wanting to go out to the shops? I'm not so sure. I was out in the shops a couple of weekends ago. Certainly wasn't as busy as I had thought it might have been. You know, businesses having to deal with social distancing. That may reduce the capacity of the number of people that can visit your business. Certainly, if you think about the local pub, they've had to make drastic changes to how they seat people, and they can't get as many people in as they did before. What impact does that have on your profitability? And they're going back to the pub again. I obviously like going to the pub. Some are seasonal businesses. So the likes of the pub will make most of its money in the spring and summer, and that will then need to see them through the winter. Well, they've had a really tough spring. Summer, I don't suspect, is going to be that fantastic for them. So how are they going to manage in those winter months without the reserves that they should have been building up over the spring and summer? So this is why forecasting and managing businesses' cash becomes very important during this period. So you might be looking at your profit and loss account, concentrating particularly on the cost side of the business. We've obviously, there's a vast number of staff that are currently on furlough. At one point, it was a quarter of the UK's workforce was on furlough. But that furlough scheme will be being phased out, as both Nick and Christopher have explained. So you need to look at your forecasting and take out the furlough payments that you have been receiving going forward. Other areas on the of expense that people will be looking at, just talking about landlords having a hard time, people will be looking at rents. They are a significant cost to a lot of businesses. Suppliers, again, you might have bought stuff in bulk previously and got a discount. You might not feel confident enough to buy stuff in bulk now. So your supply costs might actually go up. And then I was also talking about discretionary spend businesses, but actually discretionary spend within the business as well. So you might put off capital projects, you might reduce the amount of marketing expenditure you have for things like that. And there'll also be lessons that have been learned from staff working at home, which may be able to provide the business with some cost savings going forward. So I think it's really important to monitor your cash and to forecast over this coming period. So you've got to know what your current position is, really understand your costs, see which costs are costs which you might be able to reduce going forward, or what costs might inevitably rise because of the situation. So cleaning products, for example, probably spending a considerable amount more now on cleaning than you ever did in the past. But what you want to be doing is your best guess going forward, and that's really difficult because you don't know what demand's going to look like. But if any of you have been to any of the Bank of England briefings, they tend to give these fan charts, which say it might range from this to this, and I think that's really important. But to do in this scenario, so that you stress test it, you have a number of scenarios that you might put in place and think, well, you know, if this happens, this will be what transpires, and then monitor against that. Don't just put that document in your drawer and think, well, we've done that exercise. Actually monitor and update it on a regular basis so that you know where you are and you can take appropriate action at the appropriate time. And that may well be, certainly when you're looking at potentially reducing staff costs, there is a period of time that this consultation will take place over, and it will depend on how many employees you have. But you need to think, well, actually, if I'm going to potentially run out of cash in 2 months' time, I need to be starting this process now. If one of your measures for survival of the business is to look at redundancy situations. As Christopher explained in his piece, I'm an insolvency practitioner, and I've been at the very sharp and pointy end of redundancy consultations, and I've probably made more redundancies than most, sadly. But the redundancies that I've made are not people that I've worked with and know well. So this is not only an emotional time for employees, but also an emotional time for the employer. Because you are potentially dismissing people that you know, like and respect, and in ordinary circumstances this wouldn't have been on your radar at all. Christopher talked a little bit about individual and collective. There are different procedures, slightly different procedures. There are slightly different timescales, but it's certainly, if you've got more employees that you're going to be dismissing rather than just a few, then you potentially have got union involvement, and you've potentially got employee representatives elected, and certainly would be saying to you that it's a good time to go and get some legal advice if that's the scenario that you find yourself in, because they are more challenging situations. But really practical things, what you really want to be doing is getting this right and treating people fairly. You don't want to be finding yourself in a few months' time in a tribunal because somebody feels that they have not been treated with fairness or respect. So the reason why you don't want to find yourself in that tribunal, not only does it take a huge amount of management time in dealing with that at a time when the business may well be struggling anyway, but also because the cost of getting it wrong, it could be quite significant. The awards can be quite large, and also there's likely to be legal costs in being represented at those tribunals. So it's really important to be acting and to be seen to be acting with fairness and respect with your employees, because that will reduce the number of potential claims that people are likely to bring, from my experience. Christopher spoke about the active listening point, and it's really active listening. You might be listening, but ask questions to get clarification of what an employee is putting to you. So really engage with the process. Certainly give space for people to be upset. People will be upset. They might be angry, they might cry, and actually just giving them space for that. And actually you might go into this feeling quite emotional yourself, so your heart might be racing, your palms might be sweaty. But if you prepare, and I would suggest that you might want to, if you're doing this for the first time maybe, that you might want to work with a fellow director or a colleague to actually run through what the consultation process might look like, and to anticipate some of the questions that the employees might have. Really try to put yourself in the shoes of the employees, have a run through before you actually do it, and then hopefully you will have identified sorts of questions and be prepared for some of the questions that employees might ask you. But as Christopher said, it's absolutely valid to say, let me have a think about that and I'll come back to you, rather than trying to rush an answer that you may then regret having said. It is a really tough situation, there's no getting away from that, but if this is about business survival, if you don't address this problem, then the whole business could be at jeopardy, and the employees that won't be subject to redundancy, or you don't think are likely to be subject to redundancy at this time, won't thank you for not having taken the steps to make some redundancies early on, such that it allows the whole business to survive. It might look slightly different, but the survival of the business is the key point here. I just want to come on to the costs of redundancy. One of the questions I quite often get asked is, we find ourselves in this very difficult situation where we know, when we've identified that we need to make some redundancies, but the business can't afford to pay these redundancy costs. So you'll kind of find yourself in a catch-22 position where you know you need to make the redundancies, but you can't afford to do so. So what is the cost of the redundancies? Well, there's on the government's website, there's some very useful guidance, and indeed there are calculators to be able to assess how much the redundancy pay might cost you. But if you look at, say, an employee that has been with your business, and I will use for 10 years, and I'll use 10 years because I can multiply things by 10, and they are, say, they started with your business at age 28, they've been with your business for 10 years, 10 complete years, they're now 38. Well, and they were being paid per week £538, which happens to be the cap for statutory redundancy, then they would have accrued £5,380 worth of redundancy pay if you were to dismiss them as redundant. So there is a statutory cap at £538 per week. You are not required to pay more than £538 per week, even if an employee earned more than £538 per week. But some businesses do like to make a goodwill gesture and pay a bit more than the statutory limit there. But if your employee is over the age of 41, so you had an employee that was 53 and had worked for 10 years for the business, they would be entitled to 1.5 weeks pay, capped at the £538 a week again. But so their entitlement would be much nearer the £7,500 to £8,000 than somebody that fell into the lower age group. Redundancy is tax-free up to a limit of 30,000. So if you were going to top up and make some goodwill gestures, provided that that was under 30,000, then that would be tax-free.
Sandra, can I just clarify on that point as well,
Okay.
that there used to be a practice where the people would roll up holiday, unused holiday and unused, or the notice period. That's no longer allowed in within the £30,000 limit, is it?
That's absolutely right, Nick. Yes, this should be just for pure redundancy pay, not wrapping up holiday or other benefits or entitlements that an employee might otherwise have had. It's got to be pure redundancy, that and that is tax-free. Otherwise, the normal taxes are payable on those amounts. I started this particular slide by saying businesses can't actually afford the cost of it. There is a loan scheme which is probably not that well publicised, to be honest with you. But if you look at the Insolvency Services Redundancy Payments website, there are details of how you can apply for a loan to make to help make these payments. And I've known businesses that do apply and make these applications. It doesn't take hugely long, or hasn't in the past, to get the loans through. And it does enable the businesses then to be able to afford the cost of these redundancies. Clearly, loans got to be repaid, but it does help with that initial cost, and you can spread it over a period of time. Yeah, so I would really urge people to follow the processes, to take advice, as Christopher has explained, the processes of redundancy, but really taking that advice, because the cost of getting either the furloughing wrong potentially, or a redundancy process wrong, could be significant. So an award made to an employee at a tribunal, and the costs of trying to defend that position as a company could be quite significant. And I've actually seen businesses fail because they cannot afford the costs that have been awarded against them. So be very mindful of getting the process right, such that you don't walk into a liability that you hadn't anticipated. I think we might well now hand over to Christopher to take us through any questions that are there.
Thanks, Sandra. Well, we've reached our hour, everybody. So what I'm going to say is thank you to Sandra and thank you to Nick for their wise words. If you do need to drop off, we'll of course excuse you. But for those who are leaving us now, we'll be following up very shortly with a copy of the slides being emailed to you, and a copy of this recording as well if you want to watch it again or share it with colleagues. But I'm going to spend a couple of minutes now looking. We have got some additional questions that have come since Sandra was talking, so I'll look at those and before closing down. So I think, Nick, one might be for you, because it says, should we use the HMRC calculator? Is that relating to?
Yeah, yes, it's for the furlough pay. I guess there's two sides to this answer. As someone who has appreciated how to do the calculation, particularly as I set it out, I would almost certainly do it myself. And the reason why is that the original calculator that the revenue introduced at the beginning, way back in beginning of April, didn't work properly, particularly it wouldn't pro rata. So there's a little bit of skepticism. But I guess the second side of that is if you use the calculator and the revenue subsequently inspects you, you've got a very good audit trail of why you paid what you paid. But my honest answer is, if you're confident doing the calculation yourself, I would do the calculation yourself.
Thanks, Nick. Another one's about the £1,000 furlough bonus scheme that's just been announced, and we're being asked. It might be one game more for you, Nick. I've got a view on it, but it's not a very good view. So it says, get the bonus payment, do we have to show that these employees are at one point at risk of redundancy, for example, or can we claim for anyone who was furloughed at some point? I don't think there's much information yet, is there, Nick? But my understanding was that they just had to be brought back from furlough for 3 months and not show they're at risk unless you've got a different.
Yes, I mean, I'd pick up on the actual wording of the revenue, which said, have been furloughed by you at any point and legitimately claimed for under the scheme. So that I would say the answer is no, you don't have to prove that they were at risk of redundancy. You just need to keep bringing them back full time through to the end of January. and paid them on average £520 per month. The revenue officers have said that they're releasing the detail by the 31st of July, but certainly picking up that they've just said that they had to be furloughed at some point. It doesn't mention that threat of redundancy explicit.
We'll wait for further details on that. Revenue love to announce things on a Friday evening.
Yeah.
We can pick out over the weekend with a bottle of wine. One of the things is for me, I think, if we are restructuring and creating a position at a lower management level, does the employee who is in the current role on a higher salary automatically get a right to be moved into that role without applying, and do we have to hold salary? It depends, really. As a lawyer, I'd usually sort of close the blinds and say, what is it you want to do? And then we'll work out how to go about doing it. But the answer is, depends on the circumstances, but generally speaking, let's say, for example, you've got a manager who is responsible for 5 areas, and there's a reduced need because you're removed from that role. Some of those management duties are going to be dispersed to other people, or not done at all, and their role is smaller and they're managing less people. Well, the answer is A, they're redundant because you've got reduced need to employ a manager in that role, and secondly, you've got an alternative position of employment which you'd need to consult with them about whether they want to apply for it. There's no point making it a competitive interview if they can do that job. It would be unreasonable not to just offer it to them and ask them if they want to do it. And you can job match in certain situations as well. It depends on your process. Because it's not the same salary here, I wouldn't job match. I would say you've got an alternative role, it's different, and there's less money, do you want to apply for it? And you can apply a lower salary because their job with their salary has disappeared. There's a new job with a new salary. So in that case, they'd be applying or accepting a new job on a lower salary. And we've got one more, which may be for me. If you have an employee consultation forum in the business, is it advisable to inform via this as well as the individuals or only for collective? So I think the question is, if it's not collective consultation, do we need to speak to the employee forum? No, legally you don't need to, but it's going back to what Sandra's saying about being transparent and engaging. Usually, if that employee forum has been a really useful way to speak to staff, then use it. Because if you can get them on board with the proposals and why you're doing it at an early stage, then they can help with the message. And you're far less likely to have them backing employees who are feeling being mistreated or us being lack of transparent if you'd already agreed the approach for the consultation forum. So it's up to you, but I would usually get a packet of biscuits out, have a little chat and see how you can work together on it, because they are one of your voices. The last question I think is, do you think there'll be future claims against businesses who refuse to furlough staff? I wonder if that means, well, I'll give you 2 answers to that, and I know we're running well over now. If you mean people that have been made redundant rather than furloughed, I don't think so, because furlough is an option. It's by agreement, and employers don't have to use the scheme. And if there's a genuine redundancy, and we've spoken about what the test is and what the process is, I can't see how an employee could bring a claim about that. Although I have to tell you that I've had a few unions write to some of my clients saying it's unlawful to make redundancies during the furlough scheme, because the furlough scheme is there to avoid redundancies and pay them a grant, and employees can't collectively consult or consult individually if they're on furlough. Well, that's not what the guidance says in terms or the Treasury direction in relation to the scheme. So our advice is you can consult and make redundancies during that process, but certainly the unions are getting upset about it, and understandably so. They've got there to protect the members. I think that's. I was going to give you a second answer, wasn't I? What was my other answer going to be? Well, I suppose if you've got employees who are continue to work compared to those who are furloughed, certainly there's upset on both sides. You have the furloughed employees thinking, well, I'm the ones who made redundant. It's not fair they're still working. And the ones that are working saying, hang on, it's sunny outside, and they're getting paid 80% to sit at home. So you get that dissatisfaction. I can't really easily see how a claim can come out in relation to that, because the ones who are furloughed have agreed to it. The ones that aren't furloughed don't have the option, because by agreement, it's our choice. You may have discrimination claims by someone saying, I'm disabled, I should have been furloughed to help me shield, or whatever it may be. You can see those kind of claims, but not actually by the furlough scheme itself. I think that is all the questions. So apologies for running over, but we wanted to deal with as many as we could for those of you who wanted to listen to those. Just to repeat, we are going to send you the slides and the recording in the near future. And I've mentioned the selection criteria, so email me for that. Other than that, thank you for listening, and we hope you found it useful. Goodbye, everyone.
Thank you. Goodbye.